The night held its breath as wind combed the weeds around the abandoned farmhouse. Whoa! The narrator watched Ava Mercer walk to the threshold where darkness pooled like oil. Ava said, "I heard a scream here." Her voice tried to be steady. A ragged stain sweated through the warped boards, and the air stung with iron. The walls leaned, listening, while the trees ticked against the glass with brittle patience. Something dragged inside, slow and patient, as if testing how far fear would stretch. Ava said, "If someone is hurt, answer me." Her phone light skimmed nails, splinters, and a crooked hinge that bled rust. Then a whisper from the hall spoke her name with a smoker's rasp. The sound wore her name thin and careful, like it had practiced in secret. Behind her the wind died, and the crickets folded into silence. Footsteps answered from the dark, a soft heel and a hungry toe. Perfectly alone. The steps copied her breath, then fell out of time, then settled back in like a hand finding a wrist. Morning cracked the sky into flat porcelain, and the town pretended the night had not spoken. Ava walked a grocery aisle while the hum of lights made a steady river. A cart squealed behind her, and the sound lined up with her pace. Ava said, "Not here." The floor tiles clicked like teeth as the wheels found every seam just after her heel. She turned, and no one stood close enough to cast that second rhythm. A boy dropped a cereal box, and the thud landed off time, harmless and human. The second cadence waited, patient, as if tasting her route. She placed oranges into a bag with careful hands. The plastic sighed, and the answer came, a soft scuff that belonged to nobody. Ava said, "Stop following me." The ceiling speaker hissed, then returned to music about summer and freedom. She pushed the cart faster, then slower, then froze. And the echo learned every change like a student with perfect memory. Detective Cole Harlan met her in a quiet interview room that smelled like coffee gone old. He kept the blinds half open, so daylight cut the table into clean stripes. Harlan said, "You believe someone is tailing you?" The narrator watched him study the waveform on her phone, eyes flicking at the peaks. He tapped play, and the steps aligned with her breath like an eager echo. Harlan said, "Could be transfer noise." Ava said, "It says my name." He paused, then rewound to a whisper that rubbed the consonants thin. The building creaked in the heat, and a printer coughed 2 rooms away. Harlan said, "We will log a report, and I will need locations." His pen scratched, and the pen sound fell a beat behind, as if mocked by an invisible pen. The silence after the clip was louder than the clip, and neither of them wanted to be the first to speak. News crawled across a muted bar TV that afternoon, serving images without comfort. The anchor's smile was a paper mask, while the chyron named a missing jogger from last fall. The narrator felt the room lean as patrons turned to read the same line again. Ava said, "That was near the farmhouse road." A beer glass met wood and made a clean note, and something in the note kept ringing. The footage showed taped boards and a dragging scar across dirt like a music staff. A man at the end of the bar shook his head and looked down, as if an answer might wait in the foam. The anchor said nothing that mattered, and the volume stayed low, but the rhythm of the captions matched a cadence Ava already knew. She paid and left a tip that felt like an apology. Outside, the afternoon felt too bright, and shadows struggled to belong to their owners. Dusk lowered like a lid, while Ava walked a narrow sidewalk that funneled sound. The narrator counted her steps, and the alley's reply. 1, 2, and the echo answered, 1, 2, perfect and intimate. Ava said, "If you are real, pass me." The answer held its breath like a smug shadow. She stopped dead, and the second rhythm stopped late by a single heartbeat. She took a half step, and it took a half step that finished her thought. Windows along the block mirrored her shape and its invisible partner. Cyclist crossed the end of the street, innocent and free of her measure. Ava said, "What do you want?" The echo tightened, and she heard a toe tap that belonged to her next step, not the one she had taken. It was learning the future, not the past. The last light drained from the bricks, and the sidewalk felt narrower than before. Ava tried to bury the fear under routine, but the silence at night unstitched her. The narrator described how she lay awake, eyes fixed on a ceiling seam that pulsed with shadows. Her chest rose slow, each breath an invitation. Ava said, "It's nothing, it's nothing." But the whisper broke apart on dry lips. Every creak of the pipes mapped itself to footsteps in her memory. The floor below her groaned, just once, like a body shifting under weight. She remembered the fire call years ago, the hesitation, the scream swallowed before she moved. She shut her eyes, but behind them the steps fell in rhythm, a clock wound by something patient. The room tasted like dust and old smoke. Her phone buzzed with a message she couldn't read. The narrator lingered on her stillness, the quiet war of holding her breath to test if silence would stay. Nina Alvarez stayed close that evening, her laugh a brittle glass that cracked whenever Ava looked too far away. The narrator followed them up a stairwell that spat echoes like seeds. Nina said, "You need people around you," her hand brushing the rail. Ava said, "They follow me even here." A cartwheel of sound rolled above them, one tread, then another, deliberate and alone. Nina froze mid-step, the color washing from her cheek. She shook her head, too quick, and forced a smile that slipped. The lights hummed overhead, trembling in their sockets. The air in the stairwell grew thick, tasting like copper. The narrator marked how their shadows stretched too long, weaving into each other until neither belonged to its owner. Ava said, "They want me," and the stairwell answered with one more step that belonged to nobody. Ava replayed an old cassette from childhood, the metronome she once used for piano lessons. The narrator explained how the tick-tock sounded harmless until the echo joined in. The second cadence synced perfectly, a heel then toe, heel then toe. Ava said, "That's the same pace." Her voice caught against the machine's static. "Oh." The tape whirred, strained by years of dust, and the rhythm kept time like a patient teacher. The room grew small, walls pressing in with every cycle of sound. She pressed stop, and the silence hit like a slap. Then faintly, the next beat landed, even though the machine was dead. Ava pushed it off the table, shaking. The tape spun across the floor like a coin refusing to rest. The narrator lingered on her eyes, wide, pupils swollen, watching the tape pulse on a beat it could not hold anymore. Eliza Crow appeared without announcement, her presence heavy with answers no one asked for. The narrator showed her leaning at the back of a bookstore, eyes unreadable beneath a shadow hat. Eliza said, "Echoes belong to those who lie to themselves." Ava asked, "Why me?" But her voice frayed against paper and dust. Eliza turned a page she never read, letting the sound snap like a bone. "You didn't move when it mattered," she said, almost kind, almost cruel. The books leaned on their shelves as if eavesdropping. Ava said, "You don't know me." Eliza smiled with no humor, a smile that knew endings before beginnings. The silence of the aisle was thicker than the air, broken only by that sentence, which trailed like smoke. The night unspooled quietly until Ava stopped mid-walk on her block. The narrator said she heard not one rhythm now, but two. The first mirrored her every move, still loyal in its strange devotion. The second fell out of step, dragging late, like something limping to catch up. Ava whispered, "There's more than one." The air between houses chilled, mist curling low to the ground. The first echo tapped perfect measure, heel and toe. The second shuffled, heavier, not hers, never hers. Her pulse stuttered, unable to match either cadence. She glanced at windows, but curtains hung still, no eyes looking back. The block was empty, yet she was not alone. The narrator pressed on the silence that clung after each beat, silence hungrier than sound, silence waiting for her to falter. Morning found Ava tracing the town like a pulse line on a map. But the narrator watched her pin red dots over alleys, markets, bus stops, places where the rhythm had learned her. Ava said, "It wants roots, not rooms." The wall calendar hung crooked, a silent metronome in paper. She wrote times beside each point, and the pattern curved toward the farmhouse like water. Outside, delivery trucks thumped, and each thump felt rehearsed by something patient. She drew a circle around the farmhouse road and felt the circle tighten around her ribs. Ava said, "Every path ends there." The clock hand twitched forward, then hesitated, as if unsure of permission. In the quiet that followed, the floor delivered one soft answer 2 beats late. The narrator held on that delay, the lag that felt like a gaze closing in. Ava pressed her palm to the map, hoping paper could cool the heat in her chest. Detective Cole Harlan carried old case files to a records room that smelled like sun-warmed paper. The narrator tracked the way he moved around the table, as if circling a confession. Harlan said, "Drag scars, warped boards, prior noise complaints." He slid photos across steel, images of floor gouges that ran like staff lines. A report from a winter 3 years back mentioned a scream no one agreed they heard. A margin note read, "Heard steps after my own." Harlan said, "Patterns make liars work harder." He circled addresses and found the same spoke pointing home to the farmhouse. The fluorescent light hummed and popped, a late syllable to his thoughts. In the hum, a footfall attempted to exist and failed, then tried again. Harlan looked up, jaw tight, and the narrator felt him abandon comfort without saying so. He took Ava's file and placed it on top, a new spine for an old body. Caleb Rourke met Ava by the river where current wrote its blunt sermon. The narrator marked how he stood with a stiffness learned from alarms that never ended. Caleb said, "It does not chase you, it learns you." His eyes refused reflection, as if light might tell on him. Ava said, "How did you live with it?" Caleb answered, "I changed my walk every hour until I had no walk left." He told her about a night when the echo finished his step before his ankle could. The water clapped under the bridge like hollow hands. A gull laughed at nothing and fled. Caleb said, "Do not gift it a rhythm, not breath, not keys, not nightly prayers." He offered a metronome that had its arm torn off. Ava took it the way one takes a verdict. The current dragged a branch against the embankment, a slow scrape that sounded like agreement. Night became a lab in Ava's living room, and the narrator settled into the wires like nerves. She powdered flower lines across the floor and set microphones at knee height. Ava said no secrets and killed the refrigerator hum with a switch. She breathed through her mouth to erase the beat in her nose. The room waited, listening back. A chair leg shifted a sigh, then still. The flower lay smooth as frost. Ava took one careful step, then stopped. The mix caught a late cousin of that step, a soft pressure with no owner. The flower did not break. Ava said, "Show me," and nothing obliged except the recorder, which drew peaks like small teeth. The narrator admired the cruelty of absence that still left marks. Somewhere in the wall, a pipe knocked once, a jealous imitation. The late step returned, sharper, and the lampshade quivered as if a breath had passed. The apartment door waited like a mouth that knew a punchline. The narrator stood with Ava in that corridor of beige paint and old echoes. She took 3 steps toward the door and felt the second rhythm arrive half a breath behind. Ava said, "Pass me if you can." The handle twitched before her fingers touched metal. A draft knifed through the gap she had not yet made. The door swung and hit the chain with a sharp plea. The second rhythm had decided not to follow, but to arrive. Ava stumbled back, heart doing math she could not solve. The hall smelled like dust and mail. Downstairs, someone laughed at a show, a sound with nothing to do with her. The narrator pinned the moment when the echo learned to predict, not merely copy. The lock rocked once more, as if considering her future. Ava whispered no, and the corridor whispered yes, in her own cadence. Eliza Crow laid the ritual out as if setting a chessboard. The narrator described her voice, low and cracked, spilling rules like warnings painted in ash. Eliza said, "You must break the rhythm or be hollowed into it." Ava listened, clutching the broken metronome, fingers white. The room smelled of candle smoke and paper rot. Eliza said, "It feeds on consistency. starve it with chaos. The candles sputtered, shadows twitching with every word. Ava asked, "And if I fail?" Eliza answered, "Then you will walk forever, but not with your own legs." The walls leaned in, eager to listen. A draft curled pages, scattering half-burnt edges across the floor. Ava whispered, "It already knows me." The narrator lingered on the silence that followed, a silence heavy as prophecy, broken only by the sound of something pacing just outside. Ex-Sheriff Dwyer sat slumped in a bar corner, whiskey glass sweating, eyes red as coals. The narrator described how his badge once gleamed, but now lay hidden in his pocket. Dwyer said, "I heard it too back then." His words dragged as though each syllable carried weight. Ava leaned closer, desperate for truth. He muttered, "It walked me home, every night whispering at my door. I quit because I could not stop it." The jukebox hummed, static flickering between songs. Ava asked, "What did it want?" Dwyer said, "Company, or a replacement." He tipped his glass, amber spilling like blood across the counter. The bartender glanced once, then turned away. The narrator fixed on the way Dwyer trembled, not from drink but from memory sharpened too often. Ava whispered, "It has me now," and his silence became confirmation. Nina Alvarez broke the last trust when Ava's story appeared on a true crime podcast. The narrator showed her scrolling through the comments, lips pressed thin, shame written in her silence. Ava stormed into her apartment, shaking. Ava said, "You sold me." Nina tried. "I thought if others knew, you'd be safe." Her eyes darted away, afraid to meet Ava's fury. Ava said, "You fed it, you gave it more eyes." The speakers buzzed with a replay of Ava's recorded whispers, now public, replayed for strangers to consume. The rhythm of her fear became entertainment. Nina said, "I'm sorry," but the apology tasted hollow too late. Outside, a heel clicked on pavement with perfect timing, as if drawn to her betrayal. The narrator lingered on Ava's face, torn between grief and rage, her trust reduced to ash. Crowds gathered at the farmhouse, drawn by curiosity and gossip. The narrator described camera flashes, lighting the rotten boards like lightning. An innocent man from town wandered too close, his steps unsteady. The echoes stirred, feeding on attention, funneling him toward the stairwell void. Ava shouted, "Get back!" but her voice drowned under chatter and clicking shutters. The man stumbled, legs moving as if guided, his own rhythm hijacked. Boards groaned, sagging under invisible weight. Panic spread, voices cracking as people shoved away. The farmhouse swallowed the sound, holding its breath. The man's cry cut short, the fall abrupt, like scissors through thread. Ava stood paralyzed, watching the echo take him as if claiming a tithe. The narrator fixed on the crowd's horror, faces pale under moonlight, realizing something ancient had been awakened by their presence. Later that night, Ava sat alone, her hands trembling against her knees. The narrator revealed how the echo whispered not just her name, but something deeper. From the shadows came the nickname her father once called her, a secret no one alive used. Ava's skin crawled, the sound coiled around her like a noose. She whispered, "No one knows that." But the echo knew, savoring each syllable. The room tightened, corners drawing closer, air syrup thick. Her eyes darted to the dark window where her reflection looked foreign, lips moving after she stopped speaking. The whisper repeated, gentler now, coaxing, intimate. Ava pressed her palms to her ears, but the voice curled inside her skull where silence could not touch. The narrator closed the moment with dread. The echo had crossed a threshold, not just a sound, but an inheritance that belonged to her alone. Detective Cole Harlan unlocked a thin gray folder that felt colder than the room. The narrator tracked his eyes as they fixed on a sealed statement with Ava's name buried in the margins. Harlan said, "House fire near the farmhouse. Delayed entry noted." The words were clinical, but the air around them thickened like smoke. A dispatch transcript stuttered with panic, a voice begging while sirens bled into wind. He read the line that mattered and exhaled like a door unlatching. Harlan said, Hesitation window, 60 seconds. The number rang in his head like a bell that refused to stop. He imagined the unmade step crystallizing into a shape that could follow a person home. The paper rasped under his thumb, a dry whisper that sounded too much like her echo. He closed the folder, but the fact stayed open, and walked beside him. Eliza Crow met Harlan and Ava in a church basement that smelled of lemon oil and winter coats. The narrator watched Eliza lay chalk marks in a circle as if drawing a bruise. Eliza said, an echo is a step you did not take, rehearsed by the dark until it owns you. Ava stared at the chalk, refusing its logic and fearing its perfection. Harlan said, you think this is contrition with teeth? Eliza nodded like a judge who had seen this sentence before. She spoke of thin places where regret learns to walk. Eliza said, break your rhythm, or it will wear you like a path. The room clicked as the furnace woke, adding a false footfall that still made them flinch. The chalk ring held steady, a small moon waiting to be named. Alva's breath shortened into beats the echo could easily memorize. They returned to the farmhouse lane, where wind wrote slow sentences across the weeds. The narrator held close as Ava stood in the road and listened to her own history step toward her. The cadence matched her stride perfectly, then edged ahead with a confidence that stole her breath. Ava said, it is my step. The admission cut cleaner than apology. Harlan glanced at her shoes like facts could hide there. Eliza said, name it and break it. Ava stepped forward and felt the echo finish her movement a heartbeat early, completing the choice she had failed to make. She tasted smoke that was not present and heard a muffled cry that had waited years. The lane narrowed until it felt like a hallway of time. Ava said, I left someone behind, and the wind answered with the next footfall. Nina Alvarez arrived with eyes that had slept badly and a phone that had done worse. The narrator watched her hold the device like it might bite. Nina said, I knew about the old call. I thought exposure would protect you. Ava's face hardened in quiet disbelief. The podcast metrics glowed on Nina's screen like a scoreboard for sorrow. Ava said, you sold my hesitation to strangers. The words had no volume but still shook the air. Nina reached out and let her hand fall, a failed bridge. She said, I am sorry, and the apology bent under its own weight. Outside the window, a solitary step aligned with the notification ping, a perfect duet of guilt and attention. Harlan looked away to spare them both, but the room had already chosen sides. Silence held for a breath, and then a new rhythm entered like a stranger at a wake. The narrator caught the weight in it first, a dragging toe that carried more than regret. Ava said, that is not me. The second cadence scraped the floorboards beneath the thought, late, heavy, and hungry. Eliza's gaze sharpened, reading the space as if it were text. Eliza said, something else heard your confession. Harlan moved to the door, listening with his hands the way cops do when sound becomes evidence. The new step paused, judged the room, then settled its claim with a wet, deliberate pull. Ava lifted the broken metronome, and its torn arm ticked once in a way no machine could. The house answered with a step from below the foundation, like a throat clearing before a name. The farmhouse loomed in moonlight, its bones rattling with history. The narrator followed Ava, Harlan, and Eliza as they drew chalk lines across the rotted floor, the salt scattering like bone dust. Ava said, no rhythm, no surrender, and her voice trembled under resolve. Harlan planted microphones in each corner, red lights blinking like nervous eyes. Eliza muttered, chaos must replace order, her words falling like stones into a well. The farmhouse groaned, a tired giant stretching in its sleep. The air smelled of mold, iron, and storm. Ava scattered metronome parts across the boards, each fragment gleaming in weak lamplight. Outside, the wind paused, as though holding its ear to the door. The narrator lingered on the stillness, a silence waiting to be broken by something more patient than time. Ava whispered, let it come, and the floor answered with a dragging step below. The cadence split like a rotten branch, two sets of steps circling the group. The narrator counted one rhythm that mirrored Ava, flawless as a shadow, and another heavier, dragging chains of silence. Ava said, "It's dividing." Harlan raised his gun, though bullets meant nothing here. Eliza whispered, "It learned to multiply." The walls flexed with pressure, dust drifting in clouds. Ava's skin prickled as the twin echoes circled tighter, like predators arguing over a meal. The lamp flickered, throwing their bodies into a dance of overlapping shadows. The heavier rhythm tugged toward the cellar, boards whining like teeth grinding. Ava said, "It wants us below," but her voice sounded borrowed. The narrator fixed on the dread that grew like a second heartbeat, one that did not belong to her. Ava stepped into memory as if it were real, smoke rising where no fire burned. The narrator painted her walking through phantom flames, her eyes glassed with guilt. Ava said, "This time I move." Her hand pressed against the door of a locked room that did not exist, but had always existed. The boards around her hissed with fire, their heat carved in echoes. Harlan shouted, "Ava, stay back," but his voice drowned under the roar of what had been. Eliza's chant wove through the air, pulling the rhythm off balance, breaking beats with jagged words. Ava leaned in, lungs seared by ghost smoke, and forced her step forward, finishing what she once abandoned. The floor quaked, the drag marks glowing red in ash. The narrator lingered on the step itself, small and human, yet loud enough to fracture years of silence. The echo shrieked without sound, its rhythm collapsing into jagged fragments. The narrator felt the room convulse, lanterns rattling, dust avalanching from beams. Ava stumbled as the floorboards heaved like lungs. Harlan slammed his shoulder against the cellar hatch, forcing it open as invisible hands tried to slam it shut. He said, "Help me," his teeth clenched with effort. Eliza pressed salt into cracks, her voice burning with command. Ava steadied herself and whispered, "No more," before driving her weight forward, breaking the beats whole. The cellar opened with a sound like thunder underwater. The stale air below poured up, damp and cold, brushing their skin like recognition. The narrator noted the silence afterward, more violent than noise, a pause waiting to decide which world it would claim. For a breath, the world froze, then the sound stopped completely. The narrator marked the silence, as if the earth itself had exhaled. Ava sagged, knees nearly giving, thinking it was over. Harlan lowered his gun, but kept his eyes on the dark mouth of the cellar. Eliza whispered, "Listen," her face pale, lips trembling. A single step echoed from beneath, deliberate, far away, but not gone. It was deeper, slower, not just memory now, but something waking. Ava's skin crawled with recognition that it had not ended, but changed shape. The broken metronome ticked once on the floor, though no hand touched it. Harlan said, "That was not hers," his voice brittle. The cellar gaped like a throat preparing to sing, and the silence bent to make room for the next sound. Days later, the farmhouse wore caution tape like a cheap halo, and the town pretended the quiet meant victory. The narrator watched Ava step past a news van and keep her eyes on the sidewalk. Ava said, "It's finished," though the words fit poorly in her mouth. Paper notices slapped the boards, each thud a polite obituary for something not dead. She slept one night without counting breaths, and woke unsure who she was without the rhythm. Detective Cole Harlan said, "We did enough," but his gaze stayed on the horizon as if waiting for a late arrival. The road beyond the fields shimmered with heat, and the wind answered no questions at all. Eliza Crow left town before dawn, and the narrator found her absence louder than advice. On Ava's door a torn page waited, its edges singed like it had survived a small truth. Eliza wrote, "Echoes rarely die, they transfer." Ava said, "Transfer to where?" but the hallway gave back only dust. Harlan said, "We will watch," though watching never stopped anything with a will. The note smelled faintly of lemon oil and smoke, a church basement folded into a sentence. Ava pressed the paper to her chest like a bruise she chose to keep. Nina Alvarez recorded a live segment in a small studio where foam walls pretended to hold the world out. The narrator watched her voice steady like a bridge rebuilt overnight. Nina said, "I owe an apology," and the meters rose as if thirsty for remorse. She paused, and a clean heel tap sounded on the floor, one beat after her breath. No one stood near the mic boom, yet the waveform bloomed in perfect measure. Nina said, "Ava, I should have protected you," and a second, offbeat tap replied like a slow clap. The room held still, listening to a rhythm that traveled without shoes. Detective Cole Harlan walked a station hallway, where the lights hummed like tired wasps. The narrator timed his steps until the air learned them and disagreed. He moved left, and a second step landed before his own, smug and predictive. Harlan said, "Not mine," and the syllables came back shaved thin. He stopped, and the echo stopped earlier, as though it had decided to arrive before it was invited. A coffee cup rattled on a desk without help, announcing nothing with confidence. Harlan exhaled and accepted that denial had retired without notice. Ava sealed the metronome in a cardboard box and taped the seams until they hummed like a hive. The narrator followed her breath as it settled into a rhythm she refused to count. "Ow." Ava said, "You are finished," to the room, and the room pretended to agree. She slid the box into a closet and closed the door with both hands, as if burying a small and dangerous animal. Silence spread across the apartment, tender as gauze. Then from inside the sealed dark came a soft practicing footfall. Not hers, learning her future in private. The final beat lingered, patient and close, and the air left no space for a reply.